attending today, and both Tessa and I are thrilled to be able to spend at least an hour and a half with you, sharing our findings regarding consulting. I think that one of the things that I just want to position is that certainly since the 1990s, I've been involved in the development of consultants, not just within big four consultancies and strategy houses, but also across a multitude of different sectors, from financial services, pharmaceutical, public sector, where we have internal business partners, freelancers. All of them have slightly different agendas regarding the development of consultants. So one of the things that is particularly important to us that we want to share with you this afternoon is the findings that have emerged from our practice over this past period of time. Tessa, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, I think that's fine. Just to say hello, everyone. And we've so far got, goodness me, we have 77 people on this call already, which I just think is fantastic that so many of you are expressing an interest in this particular area of inquiry. So thank you for joining us, and let's make it as interactive and high energy as we possibly can.
All right. Okay. So the overview of the session itself, we're going to cover something a little more in the introduction, and we're going to set the context as to why it is that this particular issue is of interest to us. The other one is that we're going to explore the landscape, and the landscape may be familiar to some of you. It may be a surprise to you. But nonetheless, that led us to examining the findings, and the findings that we have come to are really enshrined in our book, which took 4 years to write and 4 years worth of research. As Gergania very kindly indicated, the development of consultants through over 45 countries has yielded something really quite surprising and not as different as one may expect. The other thing that we'll do is look at what the implications are for consultants and their development. And even more recently, as the past 2 weeks, where I was working in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, once again, these findings came to the fore and were only further served to confirm what our initial discoveries were, and then we'll draw some conclusions. Now, interspersed within all of this, there is going to be an opportunity for you to meet with some of your partners. I understand that we have up to 50 breakout rooms that we can go with here today. So you will get the opportunity to at least meet some of your fellow colleagues. So that really covers the welcome and introduction. Now, the first thing that we would like to really go to is to use the facilities that we have here. So could I encourage you then to use the chat facility and also the response facility, the responses that you have in the Zoom platform as well.
The reactions.
The reactions, but particularly the chat function as well.
Yeah, the chat function is the easiest one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, so I don't know how many people here have read the report that was published in 2020 for the Center for Management Consultants Excellence. I don't know if anybody has ever looked at that. It was, I think, sponsored by the Worshipful Company of Management Consultants here in the UK. Now, the reason why I bring that forward is because when it looks at trends, it looked at the challenge specifically of looking at consultants moving forward into 2030 and beyond. And some of the ideas I thought which were really quite interesting, because the trends themselves identified a number of areas which we have seen manifested. Some such as, and I'll just quote some of them, cybersecurity, AI, the big rise in self-employment, particularly in the consulting industry, big data, the Internet of Things, globalization. Now, all of these words themselves echo and articulate future trends within which the skills themselves need to be focused. But what we see in common that support these trends is a number of key factors which we will go into in greater detail. So I just want to highlight what some of the common themes are, because irrespective of whether or not there are new skills, and unquestionably there are new skills, and irrelevant to the technical expertise that individuals bring to the field, there are certain common aspects in skill development that come back over and over again, irrespective of the level of practitioner, irrespective of the industry, and irrespective of where someone chooses to focus their attention. So let's just, if what I'd like to do now is to take it down to a level of granularity and then build it back up into some of these skill sets. Because when we think about the development role of the consultant, a developmental approach, what do we mean by this? Well, fundamentally, the first things we look and what we see is that the relationship which sits at the center of the consulting paradigm very often comes back as being a fixed paradigm. And it becomes organized by the parameters of what people, or the industry, or the particular area that people work in, define the consulting relationship. Now, one of the things that has become a particular feature, and it's become a feature of my professional career, is the amount of times that we've developed competency frameworks that support the consulting endeavor. And those are tremendously brilliant in being able to measure and codify what is important for the consultant. But irrespective of that, what we do find is that we have a repeating pattern. I just want to go through some of them. So first of all, that relational patterns between consultants and clients tend to be fixed. And what we mean by that is that there are certain language patterns that get repeated irrespective of the level of seniority of the consultant. So when you have the consultant relationship that begins to evolve based around some form of transactional activity, the maturity of the language pattern doesn't necessarily alter. And what we found really fascinating interviewing clients and users of the consulting practice is that they find that there is an incredible amount of rupture that occurs in the relationship, fundamentally based on the immaturity of the consultant to navigate the relational paradigm. And I'll go on to say a bit more about that later on. The other part that came forward is that when we start to look at the consultant relationship, one of the other areas that became very paramount was the consultant's personality, and just how powerful the personality and self-identity can be, not only in securing effective relationships and great business, but also in advancing the role of the consultant into the organization itself. This relates to how we show up. Now, in our professional practice worldwide, we have seen some phenomenal, skilled, elegant, and sophisticated consultants at the most senior level and at the most junior level, contrasting individuals that it's staggering that they're even in the field of consulting. And so we have seen the breadth of this paradigm in the way in which relationships are structured. It may also come as no surprise to you that the mindset as well is critical, and how we formulate the way in which we present ourselves into the consulting relationship has as much to do with how we conceptualize, understand, and bring our awareness to this process. It therefore led us to a number of key points: that the successful relationship was not just based on trust. Trust, I think, is probably in many ways a most overused statement, and although critical, is often misunderstood. The second part, which is the bit that we're really going to focus on here, is how the relationship evolves developmentally, and particularly the multitude of different relationships that are necessary to evolve developmentally the consultant and the consulting relationship itself. So that's really what the future of consulting in some part is about and why we look at this as a developmental approach. Tess, is there anything you want to add at this point?
No, that's fine, Keith. Carry on.
All right. So why is this important now? So what we see are the emerging trends, as we said, of the Internet of Things, of artificial intelligence. Now, one of the things that we have found, which is actually most interesting, is that at one stage, when I began in the consulting career, when I left clinical psychology and moved to organizational psych, in those days, information was a real bonus. But so much of what we do now is available, freely available from a technical perspective on the internet. And so many of the clients are so sophisticated that what we had as knowledge is power ceases to hold in the same way. And so the change in client organizations is happening fast because they're time poor, overloaded with data, limited in time to reflect, and looking for instant solutions and unfamiliar challenges, which in some ways are unsolvable. So for the consultant's perspective, what we end up with is that it ceases to be the consultant that is the solver of problems. Our ability then to migrate from a solver of problems to somebody who can embrace both the problem and solution paradigm, as well as the polarity of where problems cease to become the issue to be solved, but more attention to be managed. So I'm going to put you now into breakout exercise and really just ask you, what are the implications do you see for consulting development? And is there anything missing from this overall list of things?
Based upon some of the things that we've heard so far, I absolutely would agree on this issue about, as consultants now, although you're right, there has already been a tremendous amount of technological change. What we see entering the marketplace are a lot of disruptive new technology, which brings into question how organizations can integrate some of this new technology. And people have mentioned artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and various other elements. I think one of the things that is now setting this apart is the speed within which some of this is now entering into people's lives. And particularly what we're seeing is our large global corporate clients is having the agility to be able to flex fast enough to take on some of this new technology as it's emerging is really challenging for them, particularly when they're faced with young tech, entrepreneurial, lightly resourced, well-funded new competitors coming into the marketplace who can adapt and respond far quicker. And where that leaves us with our clients is in unfamiliar, uncharted waters. And so I think the point that Nosombi raised about the fact that actually we need to increase our knowledge and be we can't be ahead of the market, but certainly be broadly read enough to understand what the global megatrends are and to understand what the new unicorn organizations are and what they're offering to the marketplace is a key part now of our roles as consultants. And the final thing for me on that is, how do you stay credible and centered and grounded in your role as a specialist, as a consultant, when in actual fact, it's really difficult to stay up to date with so much change going on? So not only are we working with clients who are in unfamiliar territory and for all the reasons we've seen are potentially a bit lost or very challenged, but we equally as human beings often feel that pressure. And so how do we stay potent with gravitas and have real credibility in our marketplace as consultants? That's what I wanted to say.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right, I just want to call out these 4 points here, which has been on the screen now for a couple of minutes. But I just want you to just glance your eyes over these, because the point that I want to make about these four things from a psychologist's perspective is this, is that, you know, we talk about the rate of change. Human beings do not have the capacity for change at the rate that technology has the capacity to change for. And so there is often a misrepresentation in terms of the way in which we assimilate the current marketplace and the way it's changing, because we simply don't have the capacity to do that. And that's not the capacity of understanding or the capacity of knowledge. It's the capacity and the rate by which we actually change, and to use Tessa's words, remain credible. So what this does mean is that and so I'm going to go to the other end of the continuum and say, clients will often say to us that they feel, as you well know, ambivalent, or things are ambiguous, all of those well-known things that we use when we talk about VUCA. But it's the uncharted territories that became a particular interest to us. And this following quote, I think, really sums it up. So I'd just be interested to get an initial reaction to this next quote, please. You read this on the screen. Now, this is an interesting statement because it calls to something inside of us developmentally from a position of identity in our comfort with the position of the unknown. Does anybody have just an initial reaction to this statement? I'd be interested to hear. Just anybody, let's just shout them out. Juliet, please. Juliet Fletcher.
Thank you. The first thing that comes to mind in this quote, and in the other things that have been said in the last few minutes, is that in my mind, it always comes back to basic fundamentals. Those don't change, whatever they may be. As a writer, there are basic fundamentals that you hold and that you use, and skills that you repeat, and you expand your capability in different arenas. But it's the fundamentals that don't change, and the who we are. We are either innately comfortable and good at helping other people, or we're not. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it, because then you start becoming disingenuous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's the same with all of that. I think it's the fundamentals. So that has been my thought as we've gone through this.
Yeah.
That's the constant.
And you're absolutely right, Juliet, because I think, you know, is it a surprise to me now? I don't know if it's a surprise to Tess, but it really is no surprise to me now, after all these years, that I see people coming through the profession, rising through the profession, and it's these fundamental core building blocks that we hold in consulting that somehow become a real challenge to migrate through. And it's through the context of this lens and some of the other things on the next few slides, we want to show you what they are. But this one here, and I think that the point that you raise about the core fundamentals is really timely and brilliantly put. Thank you so much for that. Let's go to Andre. Andre, do you have a view, please?
Yes, I was just writing it in the chat. Yes.
Good man, Andre.
Yeah. So, Keith, well, in my opinion, what I see is that this is actually what, we talked about Benny world and the VUCA world and everything. So we are constantly living in the ever-changing world. And this is going to be our future. I mean, it will be totally unpredictable. And for some of us that work in the strategic planning, like myself, this is a huge challenge, right? Yeah. So what happens is that now we need to pay attention to our skills in what regards to learning and adapting to the realities, because the realities are going to change, and for planning this is really complicated.
Do you know, it's really fascinating because what it reminds me of, we were a few years ago now, we were working in Johannesburg with one of the big investment banks there. And I remember talking to one young man who was staggering in his ability to live skillfully, to use this phrase, in the unknown. And this was how he described it. We asked him why he'd chosen a career in investment banking. And he said, very simple. He said, I want to change the world through finance. And I thought, whoa, that's pretty grand for a 20-something-year-old to come up with. So I inquired a bit further, and this is how he described his life to me. He said, when I was 16, I began a not-for-profit organization, which was about the homeless in South Africa, for which I was able to gain funding from the Clinton Foundation. I then subsequently went on into university and developed another not-for-profit organization for which he gained funding from the Gates Foundation in Africa. So he said, I've done this twice now, and I'm now in my early 20s, and I have the belief, the fundamental intrinsic belief that I can change the world through finance, because the evidence of my life is that that is the case. What's interesting about it was that he spoke about it in the context of being utterly comfortable in the unknown, and his anxiety only ever really transpired when things settled into certainty. Do you remember that, Tess?
I
He
do.
was
Very
so
impressive.
attracted to change. His whole life was about the possibility and catalyzing change on a continuous basis. Thank you, Andre, for your comments there. Let's go to Adalwin.
Yeah, it's Adalwin.
Thanks, Adalwin. Please.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, I was saying that I agree with the statement, the quotation. But the thing is, in reality, people don't behave like this, right? Most clients will tend to rely on things that they know, things that they're very comfortable with, and not step outside of those comfort zones, right? If they do, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, and there's going to be some resistance, right? You talk, I think, and somebody raised the point about even spiritual intelligence, right? So to even step into the realm of intuition, even like, at least in my experience, like pulling insights from other industries or from other roles or areas, there's resistance to it, because it people like to have things compartmentalized in these neat little boxes, and anything outside of that is uncomfortable. So again, Francis's statement makes sense, but I'm not sure how valid it is in our current reality.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think that there's an interesting contrast that you raised there, which is both pertinent and relevant, which is the need for certainty in clients. And just to that particular point, and I'm thinking how other consulting houses are dealing in the strategy field. The one I'm closest to is McKinsey, apart from KPMG. And what they have done recently is recognize the fact, certainly in London, that the strategic imperative of startups, they work on a 5 and 6 week strategy cycle, not a 5 and 6 year strategy cycle, which is completely different in terms of the way they're thinking, and the way they deal with that is to acquire different types of organizations that have different ways of thinking about strategy. So it's very interesting how some of these kind of bastions that we hold, the Bains, the Bostons, the McKinseys of the strategy world, are expanding their parameters in terms, because they know that their way of thinking is limited into the landscape that they move. Okay, let's move on, because there's some big slides that I want to bring up, and we are fast running out of time. Tessa, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind speaking to this next slide. Okay,
that's absolutely fine. So if you can keep an eye on the chat lines, Keith, and on anyone raising hands.
Sure.
We summarised part of our findings. So we've created 3 different parts of our findings, which we'll go through today in this session. The first part is we wanted, in a simplistic form, you talk about context and structure and the need for certainty. So we wanted to create what we see as the consulting landscape based upon our 60 years combined experience of working around the world. And there are certain elements of the consulting landscape which we see generally consultants do pretty well. And those are the task piece, the financial and commercial piece, and generally the technical specialist piece, because that's often what's brought them into the consulting field. The elements where we see less strength are in the elements of relationships and how they have the relational skills and the recognition of the maturity of relationships to know when and how to optimize their own presence in those relationships. The process part, and this process part is a really fascinating one and quite difficult to describe, but it's things like when you go in to meet with a client, where does your energy go first? And the degree to which you pay attention to orientating yourself and your client into the conversation, the degree to which you contract, and by this I mean psychological contracting, so gain agreement on the points that are important for you to consider together, immersion into what is currently known. Often people sidestep this issue and go straight to task in terms of what's required and let's get on with it, rather than immersing in, before we do that, let's just explore the current context and any elements which are emerging as core themes that may influence some of the solutions or decisions that we might offer to our clients. We are constantly hypothesizing in that process. We are anticipating where there are points of compression. And by that, I mean where the client system may push back, or the environment may push back, or there may be challenges around budget, or challenges around availability, or challenges around time. How we address these points of compression and anticipate them in advance. So the navigation of the relationship, each conversation, and the elements with stakeholders within the system as we move through that process. And then the other piece in the bottom left-hand corner around the context, and I think we've spoken a bit to this already, which are the degree to which we as consultants need to understand any of the systemic factors that can influence the project and the relationships that exist with our client and with ourselves within our own consulting environment. So if we are employed consultants within a consulting firm, there will be systemic factors that will influence the way in which we work with our clients. So for example, in some of the big four global consulting firms, they have these crazy targets of being utilized and chargeable for 95% of your time. There are elements like that that will affect the way in which you approach a client program. The geopolitical landscape, as we've seen, is changing literally by the minute right now. The financial interdependencies that exist around the world, the megatrends we've spoken briefly about. So there are lots of elements, including things like organizational culture and areas of power and politics that exist within the organization. Now that's the terrain, but the key to this that we see is for us as consultants is how effective we are in our use of self. So, I'm 58, Keith is 64. We are still learning every single day, seeking out what's new, what's happening, being reflective on our own practice and the elements and emerging thoughts and trends that are coming to us. Staying curious about clients, even clients we've worked with for now, some of them over 20 years, we stay curious because the whole system is moving all the time. So we are hypothesizing and rehypothesizing all the time, exploring and being comfortable with this element of constant change. I can't remember who said the quote, but someone once said, there is nothing so constant as change. and the rate of change, as we've seen, is getting faster. And those big organizations who are not gearing up for the ability to innovate and for the ability to let go of some old traditions are those organizations who will be under threat in the future. So this is our summary, if you like, of the consulting landscape. So the second part of our findings is just zooming in on the use of self. Because what we see in so many consultant development programs and so much learning and focus on investment in consultants is we focus on the actions that consultants take, what consultants say, and how they present themselves. All of the elements that are visible on the outside. And yet what we see and what we know through the years of working with literally thousands of consultants in many different levels and in many different sectors, is that it's the engine room that drives the external part of the consultant, which is the piece that actually enables and empowers the way in which we show up with our clients and the impact that we have. And these things on the left-hand side all go on the inside. They are unseen and they are part of our own very deeply personal landscape that so often goes unspoken about. You know, there's been some work recently with the likes of Carol Dweck, who's talked about a growth mindset. And we've seen work with, what was her name, who talks about vulnerability.
Brene Brown.
Brene Brown. Thank you, Juliet. Brene Brown. And there's so much more to this. Things like our own individual sense of self-identity. This is really deep work because fundamentally, if I believe myself, I'll use myself as the example. So if I believe myself to be the younger of two daughters, the only one in the family who was hugely emotionally extrovert, someone who was always told to be a good girl, not to interrupt, not to overtalk. My sense of self-identity grew up from a really shy, introverted person. And the seed of that person still exists within. So how do we adjust and grow and evolve our sense of identity? How do we learn more about who we are, how we actually are in this world, how we want to be in this world, and what we believe ourselves to be? We've raised already this element about making meaning and decision making, because it's not just our clients that are flooded with data. We also are flooded with data and information, and we have to find a way to manage that to a point that it is workable, that we can stay focused on the things that really count for us and for our clients. We have to, irrespective of our age, our maturity, and our experience, stay open and curious and humble in the face of all of this. I'm loving that, Juliet. This is a much deeper conversation than I expected when I signed up for this.
Excellent.
And
Andre's got a hand raised. Nadia, please.
And resilience and empathy and our ability to stay calm.
Thank you very much. In fact, I was really, I was excited with your speech, Tessa. You bring us so many ideas, so many, beautiful things about our job as a consultant. What I wanted to say, when we talk about information, data, etc., just remind me with this very important or very famous, how we call it, a triangle. When we talk about data, information, knowledge, and the top of the pyramid or the triangle is the wisdom, as we call it, wisdom. I think here is the most important role of the consultant, because data, information is nearly available now everywhere, as everybody knows. But the role of the real consultant to bring to his client, or bring him to the level of the knowledge and the wisdom, to help him to take the right decision based on the right data. That's what I wanted to share with, and I think everybody knows, because I always, just to share the idea, I always start with my consulting or training. I'm a strategic consultant. I start with this pyramid, in fact. So to focus on the importance of the wisdom and the importance of having the right decision based on the right data. And this is our role now as a consultant, with the huge number of data, technology, Zoom, IT, I don't know, big data, 5G, whatever you call it. Thank you. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you, Tessa. Yes.
That's wonderful. And where I go in reaction to hearing you say those things is that based upon our experience, there are so many parts of intelligence within ourselves that we can draw from. So Keith has already mentioned the element of spiritual intelligence, but we have obviously our intellectual intelligence, we have our emotional intelligence, we have our somatic intelligence. So when we notice that our breathing is tight, or when we notice a degree of physical anxiety or tension within our body, that is data. And some of that may be ours, and some of that may be us picking that up from our client or our client's system. It's data that we can consider. And as you say, we have our wisdom and our experience. And I put a cautionary note on wisdom and experience, because wisdom and experience is founded on two principles. One is it's based in memory, and memory can notoriously evolve and change over time. And the second thing is that wisdom and experience happened in the past, and the past is not the present. So there is something about the mindful application of our wisdom and experience, given our openness and awareness to the current context. So I just wanted to raise that.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Tess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before we go on to the final part of our findings, just to underscore some points about this issue of wisdom. If we think about younger people coming into the consulting profession, those that are joining the profession, what we are faced with fundamentally is, both from a psychological developmental perspective, is a number of things. One, the hippocampus. I don't know if people are familiar with how your brain functions, but the frontal part of your brain within the context of younger people is actually developed differently to us. And I'm making a generalization about the people that I can see on the screen of a similar age. And the reason why I say that is because the addiction to data or information has formulated a different part of the brain. The frontal part of the brain that you have is not the one you were born with, by the way. It's one part of the brain that regenerates itself. Now, as a consequence of that, the individual, the chemical addiction to information changes the way in which younger consultants are able to tolerate these very issues of unknown and ambiguity. The other part is that everything that's on the left-hand side of this screen is actually predicated in insight-based learning, not logic-based learning. And that operates in a completely different frame of reference. The final point that I want to say, which is actually the issue of wisdom, is that irrespective of those statements, 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, people coming into the consulting profession have a wisdom that they have that we will never share, that we will never have access to. Because although I was a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old, I'm not a 20 and 30-year-old in 2022. And so there is a wisdom that is inaccessible to us, but open if we're prepared to inquire into the younger generation as the platform for the future of consulting. And I think that's one of the great joys of our profession. Let's look at the findings in part 3. Now, this particular dimension is one that encapsulates the ability that an individual has to really become elegant in their consulting practice. And I use the word elegance in a very determined way, because when you see consulting that is beautifully articulated and crafted with a client, there is an elegance and a sophistication to what we do that is almost dance-like. And so I just want to go through, because people who are really super successful in the consulting profession have the ability and the agility to move between these 5 different relationship dimensions with a client over a period of time as it gestates through maturity. So just to go through these very, very briefly, what we have is the formal relationship, that relationship which is about how we meet the client, how we contract with the client, how we discuss the issues itself. Then you move into the developmental relationship, where the client begins to express their insecurity about a project or their uncertainty about their role in the market position. But there's also a collegial point here, which is the ability that we have to learn from each other. And that comes from a spirit of generosity, through the heart of generosity itself. The next part that I want to talk about is the one that sits within each one of us, which is the imagined dimension. Now, so often, and particularly if I think about the extent of our work in recent years, which has almost extensively been with boards. So we've been facilitating executive boards, and the amount of information that is imagined at that level will be of no surprise to you. But more importantly, is how what is imagined drives behavior. It drives behavior through assumptions, through groupthink, through magical thinking, through a whole range of fantasies that get developed that never get checked out in reality. But as that relationship, and as we see the authenticity and intimacy that begins to develop through, if we look at it through a trusted advisor-based relationship, we end up in the person to person. Now, what's important about this relationship that is not often articulated is that it's a relationship of reciprocity. And what I mean by that is that where you see the consultant who is doing all of the activities to generate trust effectively, all of the behaviors necessary to inculcate certainty with the client, it works both ways. Often it's articulated that it's everything that you do as the consultant for the client to generate trust. Actually, what does the client do for you to generate trust? How committed is the client in the relationship with you to foster the very best that can be gleaned from that? And when the relationship has matured into a person-to-person relationship, you end up in a very different dimension, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. And then finally, the shared experience, those moments that occur at the closing of a project, of a long engagement, when you both had different experiences, but nonetheless have shared a similar journey. Now, each one of these 5 dimensions have a different language pattern, a different set of behaviors, a different knowledge base. It requires wisdom, intuition, elegance in language, shifting of language patterns to bring this to life. And so when we talk about a developmental approach to consulting, we're talking about all of the brilliant technical stuff that we bring, but in addition to that, our ability to develop real elegance and sophistication in the way these relationships are navigated and nurtured over time.